Hi everyone, my name is Ameya Pawar and I'm the former alderman of the 47th Ward, and I'm here with Daniel Epstein, who is running for the Illinois Supreme Court. Full disclosure, Daniel is my brother-in-law, so I have to say nice things about him, personal, but let me also be clear, I am supporting Daniel in his run for the Supreme Court because I think he is the most qualified person for the job. He's also running a real bold and progressive race around changing the way the courts work so that they work for people, changing the way the courts work so they actually represent the interests of vulnerable communities, and changing the incentive structures and the rules of the courts so that they don't work against justice, they actually work to find truth. That's why I'm supporting Daniel. And again, full disclosure, I'm here again because I'm asking you to vote for Daniel. I'm asking you to help his campaign as we get to March 17th, but also because I want you to meet the guy that I know while he's running for judge, and it's for the Supreme Court. I want you to get an understanding of who he is, what makes him tick, and why he's doing this and putting himself out there. So the thing about politics, any type of politics, is very retail, so I got a few questions for you.
Yeah.
How old are you?
34. I'll be 35 when the seat changes.
Where'd you go to school?
University of Chicago Law School.
Where'd you grow up?
Evanston.
Do you have a driver's license?
Yes, I do.
Do you have your law license?
I do.
And
yeah,
how long?
Intact.
And so you look young, you are young. Are you the youngest person in the race?
Yeah, I'm the youngest in the race by about 35 years. I'd be the youngest on the court by about 30 years. Mm-hmm. And I'd be the youngest on the bench in 101 years. 101 years ago, there was a 31-year-old named Floyd Thompson, who actually came from the same law firm that I came from.
Somebody used a legal term, there's precedent.
There's precedent, that's right. We're not, this isn't an issue of first impression, there's precedent. But here's the really interesting thing. Not only is there precedent, if this were the first Illinois Supreme Court, I'd be the oldest justice on the bench. So the court actually used to be really young, and over time it crept up. So no, it's quite seasoned.
So what do you say to people about this job, right? I mean, I think most people would be kind of surprised to find out that you elect the Supreme Court, right? We watch the confirmation hearings in the Senate. Yeah. Why do we elect our Supreme Court justices in Illinois? What do you think of that system? Yeah. And why this seat? Why not Congress? Why not something else?
Yeah. Well, initially, some other folks have asked me this question, and usually what I say is, I'll tell you what I think of electing judges on March 18th, and I'll either think it's a great system or I'll think it's the worst system. No. Yeah. But at the federal level, the president nominates Supreme Court justices, and then the Senate confirms them or doesn't confirm them, as the case may be. In Illinois and some states, we elect our justices. And I think the idea is to give the community a greater say over the kind of justice system that they have. And there's pluses and minuses to it. But in Illinois, there's actually something really unique, and I think this goes to the second part of your question, which is why run for this seat and not something else? Yeah. In Illinois, there's something really unique, which is that the Illinois Supreme Court is kind of the final arbiter on court rules. So the Illinois Supreme Court doesn't just decide cases, they write all the rules for how our courts operate, rules of procedure, rules of evidence, rules of ethics, these things that kind of linger in the background that folks don't think about much unless you're working within courts a lot. And those things, though, that linger in the background have a huge impact on our experience with the courts. And the Illinois Supreme Court, unlike other places, is the final arbiter. So can I nerd out for a little bit?
Yeah, okay. Go do it.
So Supreme Court of the United States also writes the rules for our federal courts, right? Federal rules of procedure, federal rules of evidence, federal rules of ethics. But they get that authority from Congress. Congress passed a law called the Rules Enabling Act that gives the authority to the Supreme Court of the United States to write those rules. What that means is if you want to change one of those rules, if you think there's a bad rule, you can call your congressperson, say, please pass a law changing that rule, and they pass a law, and if it's in conflict with the Supreme Court's rules, the law wins. Mm-hmm. In Illinois, it's flipped. In Illinois, our Supreme Court has interpreted our state constitution to give rulemaking authority directly to the court from the Constitution, not from the legislature.
How far back does that go?
Oh boy, I mean, I don't know how far back it goes, but the leading case, I think, is called People v. Jackson. I think that was 60s or 70s, is the one where they get cited a lot for the state's interpretation of the judicial power as including a lot of rulemaking power.
So break this down in the lay terms. Why are rules. Look, in every arena there are rules, right? Like, and the rules by which you operate.
Yeah.
But why is rulemaking such an important aspect of your campaign for the Supreme Court?
Yeah, I mean, it's important because even though it is oft ignored, it has a huge impact on how our courts work and how we experience those courts, right? And ultimately, justice has to be something that we experience. So if there are rules that are getting in the way of giving us what we want from our courts, then we have to reform those rules. So,
So give me an example of like a rule that you think is fundamentally broken, and may lead to, I don't know if miscarriage of justice is the right word or term, but if you can give me an example.
Yeah, I can give you an example that actually links back to what we were just talking about, which is who gets to write those rules, right? So there's a case called People v. Davis a while back. And to understand what happened in this case, you have to understand a little bit about, you have to understand the following, which is that in Illinois, our judges don't have to explain how they got the sentences they did. It's a guilty 25 years, next case, right?
So there's no standard?
I mean, sometimes they do, but they aren't required to.
Got it.
Right? And so what that means is,
Seems arbitrary.
I mean, it ain't great. It's not ideal, right? I mean, we had Swedish cousins come to our house for Thanksgiving, and when we told them about this, they were like, "That's inhumane, right? You're going to sentence someone to 25 years, and you're not going to explain how you got the sentence you did? That's ridiculous." Like, they viewed it as a human rights violation, right?
Yeah.
But in Illinois, it's just the norm, and it's a problem too, because if you make a mistake in sentencing, which happens with some regularity, it's very difficult to get that mistake fixed by appealing to a higher court and saying the lower court made a mistake, look at the mistake, please fix it, because you can't point to anything where they made the mistake, right? They didn't show their work, as every good math teacher always says, right? And so
Now, do you think that's by design?
Yeah.
Is that a way to make sure that, to affirm the judge's rulings, or to make sure that it's not overturned?
I think it's a combo of things. I mean, I think facially it's really about what people would say, conserving judicial resources or judicial efficiency. I think it's minimizing the burden on judges so that we can continue to have high caseloads and a fast pace, right? And but underneath that, I mean, judges really don't like being reversed. It's bad for their reputation. I mean, other candidates in this race are campaigning saying, like, I get reversed very rarely, right? It's a mark on their own quality, and I think it says something about kind of their view of themselves as to whether they're interpreting the law in ways that others agree with, and so they don't want to be reversed.
So it seems to me that what this is, the rules is in some ways kind of tied to incentives. What are the incentives for judges to either show their work? Yeah. Currently, there's a disincentive to show the work. Yeah. Do you have other instances where there are really bad incentives in the system? There
are a lot of really bad incentives in a lot of examples. But just as kind of an anecdote, my dad, your father-in-law, is an attorney, and one time he went behind the bench to grab a form, and he saw a little sign that the judge had put up for himself, and it said, "Make your ruling and shut up." Right? And the idea is you don't want to say too much, because if you say, the more you talk, the more you speak, the more you put stuff on the record, the more likely you are to get reversed. You're creating appealable.
That just doesn't even seem normal. Right. I mean, it makes no sense.
Right. Well, you don't want to get reversed as a person, right? It feels bad, and we need to understand that these are human institutions where people behave that way. And but at the same time, where people make mistakes, we need people to be vocal and communicative so that those mistakes can be fixed. And so sometimes those things are in conflict, and that's why we need to have things like required explanations of sentences.
I totally agree. This makes what's interesting is, as a former elected official, one of the things we did was we write a weekly newsletter to explain why we made a decision or why we took a vote. And you're not immune from making mistakes. I certainly made mistakes in my 8 years in office.
Newsflash.
Yeah, well, you have to be willing to admit mistakes, but I think it's also important to learn from them. And if the system is set up where there's no reason to show work, therefore no reason to ever admit that you ever did anything wrong, because any admission of, maybe you made a tactical mistake or what have you, that it's a negative mark on your record. That makes no sense. Can you think of any other places where you think institutions are rewarded for making a bad decision?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, here's one of the ones that's most shocking to me, which is that in Illinois, when courts convict, they're entitled to extra funds.
I mean,
If a court convicts, it is entitled to extra funds. If it acquits, it's not. Right? So
that makes no sense.
right. So this is actually in statute. Let me kind of give it the most
Wait,
generous.
can we pause here for a second? No, not you. Them. Can you say that to the camera?
Yeah. In Illinois, courts are entitled to extra funds if they convict.
I mean, that makes. I am shocked. I can't believe that we live in a system where someone is profiting off of convictions, and there is an incentive to convict more, so there's greater incentive for profit. It makes no sense.
Well, this goes back to what you were saying at the very beginning, right? Which is that sometimes kind of social justice and corruption are viewed as different things, but sometimes they're the same. And the only difference is sometimes our corruption is legal corruption. There's a such thing as legal corruption. Not all corruption is illegal. It's corrupt if something is pushing us away from making decisions or behaving in a way that is in line with our goal or the way of the proper mode of behavior, right? So this statute that exists that makes it so that courts are entitled to extra funds if they convict, it's ostensibly legal. No one's called it illegal, but it's still corrupt, right? Those two things can coexist. And in this case, I mean, you asked how this is possible. Let me give it the most generous version I possibly can, because this is the idea.
Wait, so has anyone written about this?
I've never seen anyone write about it. The only places I've seen there was an Atlantic article years ago who talked about the fact that our forensic labs are entitled to extra funds if they produce an analysis.
So what do your opponents say when you present this in forums?
They don't say anything. They don't respond to it at all.
The incumbent,
Yeah.
Justice Neville,
Yeah.
has he ever referenced this or tried to address this in any meaningful way?
No.
So what would you do?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing is we have to understand how this works, and it's through something called fines and assessments.
Yeah.
So here's the genesis of the idea, which was the money doesn't come from the Treasury. The money doesn't come from this kind of background bank. It comes from the defendant.
Yeah.
Right. So Judge Ameya, you've convicted me, right? And what you're saying is I've done this bad thing that required the expenditure of resources on an adjudication and incarceration and analysis, all this stuff, right? Why should the taxpayers have to pay for it? I should have to pay for it. That part's fine. But here's where the problem starts. The money that I then owe doesn't just go to the Treasury. It goes back to the court, right? Back to the forensic lab. These entities that we really rely on to be
But
impartial.
you're dependent on it.
I mean, one of the problems is we actually don't have really great data on how much there is, how much money is flowing in this way. By the way, Illinois Supreme Court responsible for producing that data and collecting that data, right? So first of all, we need to start taking the first steps to understand how big of a problem is this. I mean, I think it's a big problem, even if it's $1,
Yeah.
but it is far more than $1, right? I talked to a judge about this, and it didn't go so well. Here's how it went down.
Really?
Yeah, it's a big surprise.
Yeah.
He said, I said, Judge, we have this problem, which is that courts are entitled to extra funds if they convict.
Yeah.
And he knew exactly what I was talking about right away. He said he knew that I was talking about fines and assessments. And he said, I have done thousands of cases in which I convicted someone and they were then charged a fine or an assessment. And I can tell you, I have never a single time taken into consideration that fine or an assessment in determining whether to convict. And I said, Judge, God bless you. I hope all judges are as good as you are. But let me give you a hypothetical. Let's say you go to the hospital for open heart surgery and you lay on the table and the surgeon comes up and says, Judge, I'm about to crack you open, and don't worry, I've done this thousands of times. You're in excellent hands. But I just have to let you know that if you die on the table, the hospital makes $50 extra. Don't worry, I've done this thousands of times and I've never once taken that into consideration in doing my surgeries. You're in excellent hands, right? Obviously unacceptable, right? And the issues are no less serious, right? It's life and liberty. And he didn't like that hypothetical. He didn't.
It's interesting that you would align these incentives. It feels like a very neoliberal construct, in the sense that, like, in the same way that, you had decades where you had reformers and sort of even liberals saying that we should outsource and privatize certain functions and sell them off.
Yeah.
This seems to me like we're selling off justice, right? Like we're trying to be tough on crime, so now we've sold that piece off. And it's probably not the cleanest analogy, but it seems to fit in with the times and sort of the philosophical underpinnings of the last 30 years.
Yeah, to me, it's less like privatization and more like leveraging, right? It's like, how can we leverage to the absolute hilt? How can we make ourselves as lean as we possibly can? How can we get every single fiber pulled as tight as it possibly can, right? And when it comes to like a city, it ends up being like a parking meter deal, right?
Yeah.
But when it comes to the courts, it might be like, how do we deal with the fact that we just don't have enough resources?
See, that's just, we have to spend what it takes to get truth.
I mean, to me, justice is the most important thing that we do as a state. And so when courts bend over backwards to take funds from the people who are most voiceless in our society, criminal defendants, right? It's really in some ways a favor to the legislature who refuses to fund our justice system at the level that requires for justice to be done. And they're never going to do that if the judiciary continues to contort itself and carry the water for the legislature, right? We see this in cash bail, right? We were just at a forum where the sitting Supreme Court justice against whom I'm running said we can't end cash bail because jails down south wouldn't be able to fund themselves without it.
Wait, so he's saying that jails can operate without bail money?
That's right. That's what he said. He said the problem is that if we don't take 10% of a D bond, jails in the southern part of our state would no longer be able to fund themselves. That's his words, not mine, right? You can go online, you can go to the CAN TV stream on this from the Supreme Court forum that was held at John Marshall. Those are his words. And what I said was, that's unconscionable to me, right? That we would perpetuate this system.
It is unconscionable.
Totally. Well, and and just to explain why, I mean, cash bail is a system that says people who are deemed safe to return to the community, who are presumed innocent, may nevertheless linger in jail for years simply because they don't have the cash to afford bail, right? And it's unconscionable for a number of different reasons. One, because it's inhumane, right? These are people who are safe to return to the community, who are presumed innocent, who just linger in jail because they're poor. But also because even economically it doesn't make sense, right? They end up going to jail and we end up paying a ton of money to keep them in jail. Yeah. So it doesn't really make sense on even an economic standpoint, from an economic standpoint, let alone a human standpoint. But when we finished the forum, he pulled me aside and said, look, Epstein, you have these ideas for changing things, but what you have to realize is the money's just not there, right? So what are you going to do?
But that's not his job.
Well, that's what I said, which is, look, that's the role of leadership. The judiciary needs to lead on justice. Let the people who do appropriations do appropriations. Let them exert our public priorities through the budget and let them make that decision. But it's not on us to carry the water for the legislature so that they don't have to make that decision, and they never will if we continue to make them carry the water.
This is why exactly you're in the race, right? Like, this is exactly the reason why you need to run and disrupt this broader system, because it's set up in many ways, nothing against the current justices or the people in the system, but if the system is set up such that it works against people or works against vulnerable communities, it's not a justice system.
When one of the things that we hear when we're at the doors is that it doesn't feel like this is a system for us.
Yeah. So we have a public institution that is incentivized to produce convictions.
Yeah. Financial rewards not for finding truth, but for finding guilt or helping to produce it. The justice system is supposed to be laser focused on finding truth. And we have all these other considerations that are creeping in and making that difficult. This is one of them.
I mean, so this system seems to be a contributor to mass incarceration.
Absolutely. Well, in a number of different ways. One is incentives matter.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So just infecting the decision-making process about whether to find guilt or not, that's the most critical thing, right?
It's frustrating because you don't normally, look, having been a city council member, in the legislative body, you know, it's got a lot of spotlight, right? So you can find those places where there are real structural problems, where there are political problems, where a little bit of both. But you normally don't think about the court systems as having the same kinds of problems that we're experiencing with the Chicago machine that are deeply embedded within the court system.
Yep.
So why aren't people writing about this? Why aren't they talking about it?
You know, that's been one of the biggest question marks for me too. I mean, I've been going to, coffee after coffee, living room after living room, and talking to people about these ideas, both in kind of like the abstract way that we've been talking about it, but also through the frame of real stories of people I actually represented, of this stuff actually panning out, and seeing the devastation that it leaves behind. And every time I do, I think that's a question that people ask: why isn't anybody reporting on this stuff? It's a question I don't have an answer for. We've been trying to get the word out as much as we can, but
well, I mean, you being in this race is actually elevating the debate.
Yeah, for sure.
Changing the debate. So you're running a very grassroots campaign, which is the kind of campaign you want to run.
Yep.
It reminds me of my first race for alderman, because when I ran in 2011, I said I want to be a legislator. We should be passing citywide policies on social and economic justice. And the pushback to me was, that job, you're a garbage man. You're the janitor. You're supposed to fill potholes and do the nuts and bolts. And my response then was, yes, it is that. Plus, you have a citywide responsibility to take care of people. Now, I spent a lot of my time on citywide legislation. I think the class that I came in with did a lot of that work. And now you have different kinds of people running for alderman. This reminds me of that race. Yeah. You're running to change the way justices do their job. Of course you're going to get resistance on that.
Yeah, and I mean, we knew that we were going to get resistance, but you're absolutely right. And I think in the same way that I think your election really changed the way that we view how the city council does its job. If we win this thing, I think it changes how judicial races are run across the country. I think it changes how much we focus on procedural justice, right? These things that sometimes are ignored but have a big impact on our ability to have a positive experience with the justice system. If we win this thing, I think it changes all of that in the same way that in some senses you did. But yeah, we're in the meantime, until we do, massive resistance, right? Because we're running against people who are part of that system that we're trying to reform. And to be honest, like, these are people who in many cases poured their heart and soul into the system with the best intentions. And I have enormous respect for it. But also I represent people who are crushed by it. And so with all due respect to those people who built up the system, which in many ways has produced some good outcomes, we can't then just sit on it and say, good, now we have this finished product. We got to continue to improve it. And I think, my hope is that I'm not too early, right? My hope is that I'm on time, and that now is the time to make that change. And some people have said, no, you're too early. Wait 30 years. Wait, go to circuit court, go to appellate court, then go to Supreme Court and do what you want to do. But it's impossible. It's impossible if you're the person who has to tell families that dad can't come home. It's not something you can say if you've been in that situation where you have to do that, and you also see an opportunity to make a difference. And so the wound is still open for me, and I think that's the time to act. So I'm hopeful that we can make that change.
So it seems to me that like a part of your job, your campaign, is to teach people, right? To teach people about the system, and about what about the system needs fixing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's this is not the kind of campaign that you can run on billboards, right? It is a political campaign, but it's also an educational campaign.
So how in the weeds do you go when you go to coffees or when you're knocking on doors? You're knocking on doors?
Oh yeah, okay. all over the county.
So what do you say? So let's do that. Yeah. Why don't you give me your pitch?
Yeah. So I mean, I'll knock on the door. Say,
I'm not home.
Can I leave a pamphlet? Yeah. No, what I'll say is my name is Daniel Epstein. I'm running for Illinois Supreme Court to prevent wrongful convictions and corruption in our state and to make it easier for us to access our courts. That's usually kind of the first line, some version of that. And depending on
What do people say when someone running for the Supreme Court shows up at their door?
right, I've never met a judge before. I said, well, I'm not a judge yet,
Yeah.
but they'll say, I love that you're here, right? I'm so glad that you're coming out here and actually interacting. That means a lot. Depending on what I say, I try and experiment at the doors to figure out what matters to people. So sometimes they'll say, look, I'm trying to end cash bail. And sometimes people will say, yeah, I had to pay it, or I couldn't pay it, right? Sometimes I'll knock on the door and I'll say, I want to make it so that you can use our courts online rather than having to take a day off work or find a caretaker or something and go all the way to the courthouse and sit in traffic and what have you. And they're like, yeah, I would have brought a case against someone who stole from me if I didn't have to take a day off work to do it, right? So you start to learn kind of the personal experiences that people are having. People are really concerned with corruption in the state.
Yeah.
And I get to kind of talk to them about how conflicts of interest are resolved in our courts and the fact that we're relying on people with conflicts of interest to determine whether they have a conflict of interest, which is a conflict of interest. And I can kind of tell stories about that, just telling stories of real cases that really happened. And depending on who opens the door, sometimes it gets very much in the weeds. There are people who know some of the stories that I'm talking about.
Okay. So you're doing all the things. You're knocking on doors. You're doing coffees. You have TV commercials up.
Yeah.
You have volunteers in Oak Park all the way to Evanston to Berwyn to the city. So you're running a countywide race. It's not easy.
Southside too, by the way.
Southside too.
Yeah.
And West Side.
Yep.
You got on the ballot without being challenged.
Yeah.
That's quite a feat.
Yeah, we needed 5,050 signatures. We turned in over 15,000.
Okay.
We had an amazing core of volunteers that helped us get there.
I was reading on your website, you've got some of the biggest progressives in the legal field endorsing you.
Yeah.
People with decades of experience.
Yep. Yeah, Alex Polikoff, he helped desegregate public housing here in the city and across the country. Sharon Fairley, former head of COPA.
Yeah. She was endorsed by both papers when she ran.
That's right.
Alderman Dick Simpson.
Alderman Dick Simpson, that's right, whose name is synonymous with anti-corruption. He's been fighting it for a career. Tony Casey, professor of law at University of Chicago.
Yeah.
There's a pretty long list.
That's really great. So then what do we have to do? What do you need to tell everyone to do?
Gosh, number one, vote, right?
Okay.
March 17th. Vote for Daniel Epstein for Illinois Supreme Court.
When does early voting start?
Early voting started March 2nd.
Okay.
There's 100 polling locations throughout the county, so you can go onto the county website and figure out where your early voting location is.
And Zach, we can bring some of that up, right?
Oh yeah.
Just
With your hands right.
with my hands right here, like right here, eye level. You can early vote right here. Yeah.
One of the biggest things we can do is send out an email to your friends, to your family, right? Most folks don't necessarily know how to judge a judge or someone.
Where in the ballot are you?
Punch number 167, so we're the top of the green pages on the ballot.
So it's far down the ballot.
Yeah.
So we need everyone who's interested in judicial reform and social and economic justice to keep flipping the pages, to go down the ballot, to get to what?
167. Yeah, look, if you're someone who's talked the talk of criminal justice reform, I have to tell you, in Illinois, if you want criminal justice reform, the Illinois Supreme Court has to be a part of it.
Yeah.
Rules reform has to be a part of it. There's a lot of stuff that cannot be done by anyone but the Illinois Supreme Court. So if you want to walk the walk, you got to get down to 167.
Thanks.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.